Well, I'm so glad that that daily word included a sentiment that I'm going to speak about today, which is that sometimes we've had rough times, and maybe that's going on for us right this moment, and we couldn't find anything about it for which to be grateful. And later on, at least for me, later, I could frequently find a blessing in that rough time. So my topic is, um, oh, okay, I know what it is. I just forgot how I worded it. Getting through tough times and not just getting by. So I want to share with you today a story from the Gospel of Luke. And first of all, I want to, because I know some of you are interested in looking at the scriptures, but you are hesitant. So I want to share with you, just because I have many translations and forms of scriptures, but this is one that I think is so accessible and it's so well done. It's based on real years and years of scholarship. And what happened was this man who was a um, professor emeritus of spiritual theology at a college in Vancouver, and he was a Presbyterian pastor, founded a Presbyterian church in Bel Air, Maryland, and was their pastor for 29 years. And I guess when he retired, he needed more to do, so he went through the entire Bible and retranslated it or paraphrased it. And it's called, I don't know if you can see this, it's called The Message. And it's so accessible and it's so easy and it's based on scholarship. And the editor author is Eugene Peterson. So I'm going to read this parable to you from the Gospel of Luke, from his version. Now this is a parable, but does everybody know what a parable is? Well, that's not a fair question. A parable is a story that Jesus told, or that other the Grimm's fairy tales are kind of like parables. It's a story that you can kind of identify with. It may or may not have happened in real life, but it has a teaching. It has a message that we may or may not actually get, which is frequently true of Jesus' parables. We've probably heard that you've all heard of the prodigal son. That was a parable. There's many parables in the scriptures that we've heard of just by virtue of being alive in 21st century America, but you may not know them. But this particular parable is one that's hardly ever referenced. And I've been going to church and studying and preaching for a long time. And I've never dealt with this parable before, and I don't remember ever having heard anyone, partly because I think it's been so misunderstood. But it's called, well, in Peterson's version, he titles it "The Story of the Crooked Manager." So I just want you to hear the language that he uses and see how easy it is to understand. And then I'm going to explore it. Jesus said to his disciples, "There once was a rich man who had a manager. He got reports that the manager had been taking advantage of his position by running up huge personal expenses. So the rich man called the manager in and said, 'What's this I hear about you? You're fired. I want a complete audit of your books.' The manager said to himself, 'What am I going to do? I've lost my job as manager. I'm not strong enough for a laboring job, and I'm too proud to beg. Oh, I've got a plan. Here's what I'll do. And then when I'm turned out onto the street, people will take me into their homes.' Then he went at it. One after another, he called in the people who were in debt to the master. He said to the first, 'How much do you owe my master?' And the slave said, 100 jugs of olive oil. The manager said, 'Here, take your bill, sit down here, quick, write 50. So he owed the peasant farm worker, sharecropper, owed 100 gallons, 100 jugs of olive oil to the man who owned the land. And the manager, the real estate manager, who had been fired, but he didn't tell anybody, said, okay, we're going to change your bill so you don't owe so much. So then he called in another servant. He said, and what do you owe? And the man said, 100 sacks of wheat. He said, take your bill and write in 80. Then Jesus continues. Now here's the surprise. The master praised the crooked manager. And why? Because he knew how to look after himself. And then Jesus says to the listeners who are hearing his story, I want you to be smart in the same way, but for what is right. Use every adversity to stimulate you to creative survival. Concentrate your attention on the bare essentials so you will live, really live, and not complacently just get by on good behavior. So just a question, have any of you ever heard that story before? Or any version of it? My guess is you've heard a verse that follows that in our contemporary Bibles. But the scholars who have studied these ancient texts, all of them are in agreement that the last 4 verses in the gospel, in that 16th chapter of Luke, were added later and were not part of Jesus' parable. But there's one verse that you've heard that supposedly is with that parable, but it isn't. Okay, I'm trying to confuse you if it's working. It says, supposedly Jesus said about that parable, you can't love God and mammon, meaning wealth. So anytime, most of the time when you hear this story about the rich landowner and his servants who worked the land, the focus goes to money and wealth. And supposedly you can't love God and have money, which that's ridiculous. But that's what people have heard in conjunction with this parable. So I want to elaborate this little story. First of all, remember that the people that Jesus would have been teaching, the people that he would have associated with, were commoners. And most of them were peasants living literally hand to mouth. And they knew good and well what it was to be in debt, actually to the cost of their own lives, to be in debt to a master, to a landowner, somebody wealthy. And they knew how hard it was to work day in and day out in the fields, in the heat, in the cold, and barely have a living existence. And those were the people that would have heard this story. So when Jesus starts talking about a wealthy landowner, their hackles went straight up because they knew the wealthy landowners, and they were mostly immoral and very greedy. And these peasants that worked for the wealthy landowners, in effect, they were slaves because they owned nothing. And their entire lives were at the mercy of the wealthy landowner, whether they had a little shack to live in, whether they had enough food, because they had, by virtue of the fact that they didn't have anything to begin with, they had to literally put themselves into servitude to try to get something for themselves and their families, so that when this landowner said, here, I'll give you a place to live and some food, it was at the cost of, and if I give you that, you owe me your life. And for the rest of your life, I'm going to come to collect what you owe me in crops and in produce that you're growing for me. So the servants, the peasants, there was no way they could ever repay that debt because the debt just kept growing. And no matter how much they were able, how hard they worked to produce crops, they had to give back such a huge proportion of that to the landowner that they barely had anything left to live on. So that really sets the setting for the story that you and I, or at least I, wouldn't have known without some study and some background. So you've got to realize that when Jesus starts talking about a wealthy landowner, they're not automatically thinking, oh, good, we get to hear about a wealthy landowner. They were, cussing the guy out and thinking, what is Jesus talking about now? Why does he do this to us? So in this story, the wealthy landowner has an estate manager, and any wealthy landowner would have had an estate manager who was also sort of in servitude to the landowner. The estate manager would have been somebody that had had some training in mathematics and bookkeeping. And so the estate manager was responsible for making sure that the peasants who worked the land paid their fair share. And everybody knew, this was no secret to anybody, including the landowner, everybody knew that the estate manager was taking a cut before he paid back what he had received from the servants. Is that clear? Are you clear? I hope I'm not confusing you. It's so foreign to how most of us live and have lived. So they all knew that the estate manager, he was getting some salary from the landowner, but he wasn't getting enough. And so he would take part of the money from, or not the crops, from the peasants who were doing all the work. So some of the peasants apparently got together and went to the landowner. Now this was remarkable in itself. The reason was most of the landowners didn't live anywhere near the community where their land was, where the peasants were working. So most of the peasants would never even see the owner. And apparently this owner lived in the same community with them. So they knew of this man, and he had a good reputation as being fair. So his estate manager was cheating, but at a much greater level than ordinarily. He was taking more of the produce from the slaves than he really should have. So some of the peasants went to the landowner and complained. This is all a remarkable situation that it would have happened that way. So then the landowner calls his estate manager in and says, what is this I hear that you're cheating my folks? I don't want to have anything to do with you again. You're fired. Well, here's the remarkable part of that. Ordinarily, if somebody in that position had been fired, the boss would immediately have taken all whatever records that the manager had, and everybody in the community would have known short with that he was fired. The other thing that likely could have happened to the cheating estate manager was he might have been thrown in jail. But that didn't happen in Jesus' story. In Jesus' story, nobody realized that this man had been fired. So he immediately went out and started calling in the servants one at a time, and he says, here, I'm going to make a deal with you so that you don't have to give so much back to me and to the owner. Well, the word got out all over town that this landowner, who already had a good reputation for being fair, was giving them essentially a bonus. So they were throwing a party and telling everybody how fair and generous and kind this man was. So that's what's happening. And I never would have gotten that just from reading the traditional scriptures anyway, without studying some background material. So that's what happened when the owner of the land, the owner of all these servants, starts praising the estate manager. Says what a shrewd and wise person he is. He couldn't very well tell everybody, no, that's not what happened, and you're not really getting this extra bonus because he cheated me and I'm going to take what I was supposed to get in the first place. So we just said, he just praised the landowner. I mean, the estate manager, which is counterintuitive, of course, that he would be praising this guy that had cheated him. But then there's this passage that I love that I read to you that supposedly Jesus said, or something like it. I want you to be smart in the same way as the crooked manager, but for what is right, using every adversity to stimulate you to create survival. Use your adversities to become stronger, to concentrate your attention on the bare essentials so you will really live and not just complacently get by. All of us have been experiencing, to various levels, some really difficult times since about a year ago. And so many people have been experiencing much greater difficulties than any of us probably. And then with all of this disaster in half of the United States with this weather challenges that we've had for the last several days, we know that those difficulties have been compounded. And I want you to think for a few moments about some time, maybe one time, maybe several times, times when things were really difficult for you, when you really didn't know how you were going to manage. It maybe have been an emotional situation. It may have had to do with finances or your employment. It may have had to do with relationships. But just hold for a moment of thought about when things were really hard. And how you got through. And when you think about that, is there any way you can say about that time of adversity that there was a blessing in it, that there was a gift that came from it? And I can't speak for anybody else, but I can tell you I've been through some really rough stuff. And I can look back on those times. There were lots of them. I was never starving. I was never in danger of being homeless. But I've had some really difficult challenges, as I'm sure all of you have. And I can look back on those challenges from a distance sometimes and say, yes, I'm really grateful that that happened. And I can see the bigger picture, and I can see that there were blessings into that. And maybe at the time, well, almost certainly at the time, I didn't see anything but darkness and fear. But looking back, I can honestly say that I'm grateful for all of those times and all the opportunities that arose from them. And I think that's what Jesus is saying in this parable. Yes, somebody just sent me a message. You saw it. Look for the silver lining. Yeah, that's it. And so it's so hard sometimes when we're in the very middle of challenges It's so hard to see that. I think we are called as believers to try even harder in these days to do that. And if we don't see it immediately, don't experience it immediately, that's okay. I wouldn't expect that to happen. But at least that we give it some attention and some intention to find the presence of God in the midst of that. And what I think, and this parable, and I won't go into that, but this parable has a lot of similarities with the the parable of the prodigal son. A lot of similarities. Um, the and I don't know where I was going with that. Anyway, when we can find the blessing in the tough times, when we can honestly say, I'm grateful that that happened, I learned something, I met somebody I wouldn't have met that I'm grateful to have met, I had an insight I never imagined, I developed a new skill because of that time. When we can do that, I think that's the point of the parable. And that's where I was going. And the point of the parable of the prodigal son, which we frequently miss, I think the point of, we usually get that the point of the prodigal son is that God loves all of us. And that God's love is embracing no matter what we've done to screw up. I think that's exactly the same point of this parable. The estate manager made mistakes, and haven't all of us? His mistakes just happened to be out in public, but all of us have made mistakes and probably make mistakes every day. Some sort of activity or thought or judgment call. And Jesus says, it's all right. I just want you to learn from it and to learn that God's presence and God's forgiveness and God's grace are available to all of you. It's really a story of mercy and grace. So I want to close by sharing with you a little bit about a man that lived in the 15th century. His name was Brother Lawrence. Anybody heard of Brother Lawrence? He was a he was in a he lived in a monastery, and he was practically illiterate. And the main thing he did in the monastery was wash dishes. Have you heard of him? Is that ringing any bells? He washed dishes. He wasn't able to read the scrolls. He wasn't able to transcribe them. I don't know if he could sing. He probably sang. He didn't do heavy labor. He washed the dishes and scrubbed the pots and pans. But his whole spirit, whole life so exuded the presence of God and love and gratitude that people came to see him, to listen to his stories and his wisdom. I mean, this is remarkable. People came from all over to this little monastery to meet this illiterate man who washed dishes, who could proclaim the love of God while he was scrubbing pots and pans. And eventually someone wrote down part of Brother Lawrence's story and his teachings. And it's a tiny little book that I've had for years. It's called The Practice of the Presence of God by Brother Lawrence. And it's so remarkable in its simplicity and its awareness of God's um, outreach to us. So I offer this as a challenge to each of us, to me especially, is when things are challenging us, or when they're not, or when we're feeling less than, or when we're feeling bored, or when we're feeling like somebody taking advantage of us, to practice the presence of God and in our thoughts and in our actions, and to enable perhaps those thoughts and actions, however menial they may be, to enable those to become a sacrament. That's what Brother Lawrence did. Washing the dishes, scrubbing pots and pans, scrubbing the floor was a sacrament to him. Doing those activities reminded him of God's mercy, and he rejoiced. Now that's quite a challenge, and I can tell you I need that message more than anybody. And I'm pleased that I can share it with you, and perhaps you will take something from it. God does love all of us. God's mercy is ever reaching and ever present. So I want to close by sharing with you an old traditional Christian hymn that I grew up with, and I know many of you might not have. I think I'm going to explain this hymn to you because it's so powerful. And I didn't know, I knew the hymn itself, A Love That Will Not Let Me Go. Anybody know that? I knew the tune. I'd sung it growing up. I loved the tune. And it was just in my mind this whole week. And I thought, what? It's so beautiful. And the first verse is so beautiful and touching, but I didn't know the background of the story of this hymn, which makes it especially powerful. The author of the poem, which it was a poem before it was a song, where's his name? Was named George Matheson. He was a Scottish Presbyterian preacher, and apparently quite popular preacher. He wrote this in 1881. But here's the story behind the story. George Matheson was in a really dark space in his life when he wrote this. He was grieving some really difficult things, and I'm going to tell you briefly. He wrote this when he would have been in his 40s. When he was 18 or 20, somewhere around there, he apparently had a disease and he lost all of his sight. He was completely blind for the rest of his life. And I couldn't figure out, I couldn't figure out if he would have had access to Braille. It had been invented by that time, but I'm not sure that it had been put into English because Braille was invented by an 11-year-old boy from France. And so, it took a while. Isn't that amazing? So it took a while for Braille to become universal so that it was in lots of languages. And I don't know if George Matheson had access to Braille. So he was 18, 20 years old. His fiance realized that he was going to be blind for the rest of his life, and she left him. He knew that he wanted to study for the ministry, and he was completely blind. So his sister studied Greek and Hebrew on her own, both of which are very difficult. Greek, anybody who's a scholar of Greek and Hebrew didn't take 1 or 2 years of language study. They studied it for decades. His sister dedicated herself to studying Greek and Hebrew so that she could help her brother finish his seminary work. and become the pastor that he was. The day of his sister's wedding, he was feeling completely devastated. You know, his sister had been his light. His sister had helped him have a life for all those years, and I'm sure he wasn't feeling regretful that she had found someone to love, but he had to be worried about what was that going to mean for him for the rest of his life. And plus he would just miss her so much because she'd been so integral to his life. That was going on, and he was probably thinking about the fiance that abandoned him years earlier because of his blindness. So this was not a joyous day for him until he said suddenly these words came to him like a vision. Here are the words, the first verse. O love that will not let me go, I rest my weary soul in thee. I give thee back the life I owe, that in thine ocean depths its flow may richer, fuller be. He went from tragedy and sorrow and heartbreak and fear to recognize the overwhelming love and mercy of God. So there's other verses, but I'll just stick with that one. So this is a prayer, and his prayer is to the God whom he calls love. O love that will not let me go, I rest my weary soul in thee. I give thee back the life I owe, that in thine ocean depths its flow may richer, fuller be. I will sing this for you because it's so beautiful. I'm moving my computer. O love that will not let me go, I rest my weary soul in thee. I give thee back the life I owe, that in thine ocean depths its flow may rich and full be. I give thee back the life I owe, that in thine ocean depths its flow. In the unending ocean of God's love and mercy, I give you back my life so that my life will become richer and fuller. Thank you for being with me today, and I pray God's blessings upon you.